When violence stops, the world does not reset. The streets remain, the buildings remain, the people remain. Life continues in the same space where fear once gathered. Whitechapel did not disappear when the murders stopped. It remained crowded, precarious, ordinary. Markets reopened, footsteps returned to familiar routes. But something subtle had changed. Places that once felt unremarkable now carried memory. A street corner might still look the same, yet it no longer felt entirely neutral. I'm Jenny. I love history, and I am fascinated by the moments where human psychology collides with it in the worst possible ways. In this series, I explore crime through context rather than spectacle, asking not just what happened, but what kind of world made it possible. This episode is about aftermath. What happens to a place once attention fades? Because eventually, attention always fades. New stories emerge, new anxieties replace old ones. But the conditions that shaped the past rarely disappear so quickly. Whitechapel remained a place defined by overcrowding and poverty. The lives that had always existed there continued largely unchanged. The murders had drawn attention to the area, but attention is not the same as transformation. For many residents, daily survival still demanded most of their energy. Work was uncertain, housing was unstable. The conditions that had allowed vulnerability to flourish remained stubbornly intact. Attention does not linger forever. New events arrive. New crises demand space in newspapers and conversation. And slowly the intense focus that once surrounded a place begins to drift elsewhere. Whitechapel was no longer the centre of public fear. But the lives lived there had never paused. Families continued to crowd into small rooms. Workers still waited for unpredictable labour. Children grew up in the same narrow streets. For the people who lived there, Whitechapel was not a mystery. It was simply home. Outside of the neighbourhood, however, the story began to travel. Once fear leaves the place that produced it, something curious happens. Details begin to shift. Stories grow sharper. Certainty grows stronger. Distance has a way of simplifying the past. A complicated neighbourhood becomes a dark setting. Complex social conditions become background scenery, and the figure at the centre of the story, begins to feel larger than the world that created him. Places carry memory differently than people. A street does not remember what happened there, but people do. Residents would have continued to walk past familiar doorways, past corners that have once drawn attention from police and journalists. Daily life slowly layered itself over those memories. New footsteps replaced old ones. But the knowledge of what had happened there did not entirely disappear. Over time, the murders became something else. Not just a series of events, but a story that travelled far beyond Whitechapel. A story that newspapers, books, and later films would continue to revisit. The place itself faded into the background, but the name remained. And that name would outlive almost everyone who had walked those streets in 1888. History often remembers violence as a moment, a beginning, a climax, an ending. But for the people who lived through it, life simply continues. Fear becomes memory. Memory becomes story. And stories slowly drift away from the place that created them. The name remained, but the streets that had once carried the weight of that fear kept moving forward. Because places rarely pause long enough to process what they have experienced. They simply continue. And over time, the world remembers the figure more clearly than the people who live beside him. Thank you for listening. Until next time, take care and be gentle with what history leaves behind.